Part 1. The Extrovert Ideal. 1. The Rise of the Mighty Likeable Fellow. How extroversion became the cultural ideal.
In early 20th century America, social changes caused a shift in cultural attitudes to favor bold, gregarious personality traits over modest, solitary ones. As more people pursued corporate jobs in cities, qualities like confidence and zeal were associated with success. Simultaneously, growing industries like advertising and film began depicting the ideal person as active, charming, and surrounded by admirers, a archetype Cain terms the mighty likable fellow. Newly popular self-help literature proclaimed that extroverts could achieve worldly fulfillment more readily than introverts. Corporate offices were designed for frequent interaction. So cultural perceptions aligned ambition and sociability with happiness. Advertisers discovered that framing aspirational messages around ideals of popularity sold products. Even banal goods were marketed via images of gregariousness and status. Hollywood promoted the archetype of the dashing leading man like Cary Grant, whose charm wins over romantic and professional interests alike. Across business, media, and social realms, the model of success shifted from the strong silent type to the outgoing showman. As the 20th century progressed, society increasingly stigmatized solitary tendencies as aberrant. Children were encouraged to be interactive in classrooms that minimized solitary activity. Theories emerged holding that one's true self should always be outwardly expressed. By the 21st century, the extrovert ideal thoroughly shaped America, from how individuals judged themselves to professional norms. Cain argues this ideal now determines success in careers from business to politics. Leaders are expected to be confident orators who engage audiences. Social media accelerates self-broadcasting. Meanwhile, the strengths of introversion, sensitivity, seriousness, insight, are undervalued. America has lost touch with temperaments geared toward inner life. Cain asserts society must recognize introverts' contributions before their cultural extinction.
2. The Myth of Charismatic Leadership. The Culture of Personality, 100 years later.
This chapter explores how the extrovert ideal has shaped society's conceptions of leadership over the past century. Cain traces how cultural attitudes have evolved to associate qualities like boldness, showmanship, and dynamism with effective leadership. This represents a dramatic departure from the 19th century cult of character, which valued moral courage and integrity over charisma in leaders. The shifting attitudes were influenced by the ascendance of industrialization and consumer culture. As big business came to dominate employment, executives were seen as visionaries who motivated the workforce through sheer force of personality. Around World War I, leadership experts began codifying these newly prized qualities like vision, communication skills, and strategic thinking. Theories emerged that the most vital personalities were destined to rise into positions of authority in business and beyond. By the mid-20th century, this kind of bold, charismatic leadership had become the cultural ideal, embodied by figures like tech visionary Steve Jobs. A 1991 study found that over 80% of people instinctively associated charisma with effective executive leadership. Yet Cain argues that this extrovert ideal of leadership has not lived up to its promises. Charismatic leaders have been behind major corporate scandals and failures over recent decades. She advocates for rediscovering the leadership strengths of introverts, whose qualities like introspection and quiet determination enabled great achievements long before the charismatic leadership craze. Cain cites examples like Eleanor Roosevelt, whose perseverance and moral courage catalyzed human rights advances despite lacking a dynamic public persona. She calls for organizations to recognize that there are many viable leadership styles involving both extroverted and introverted qualities. The most effective leaders tap into the full spectrum of personality traits depending on the situation and values at play. In a world still enthralled by the extrovert ideal, Cain hopes society can learn to appreciate still waters that run deep in leadership. The myth of charismatic leadership will give way to more nuanced, ethical models valuing wisdom and conviction as much as charm and vision.
3. When collaboration kills creativity. The rise of the new groupthink and the power of working alone.
This chapter examines how the extrovert ideal has fueled a workplace culture of constant collaboration that undermines creativity and productivity. As open office layouts become ubiquitous and team projects dominate over individual work, solitude has become stigmatized in corporate environments. The prevailing belief is that generating ideas in group brainstorming sessions leads to the most innovation through building on each other's ideas. However, Cain argues that this new groupthink workplace philosophy is flawed and counterproductive. She highlights extensive research showing that the quality of ideas developed in groups is lower than ideas individuals conceive alone. Brainstorming groups follow patterns like rallying quickly around a few popular ideas while rejecting outside-the-box concepts. The presence of others limits people's creativity. Most subjects tasked with problem-solving perform worse in groups than working independently. This is especially true for introverts, who need solitude to incubate ideas and focus deeply. Cain gives many examples of prominent innovators across fields like art, science, and technology who forged their most groundbreaking ideas working alone in serene environments. Charles Darwin came up with his theory of natural selection far from the traditional scientific institutions of the day, for instance. Cain argues that modern researchers need more uninterrupted time to channel this style of deep work instead of constantly multitasking in noisy open offices. She calls for organizations to rethink assumptions that teamwork is always the best approach. Businesses should create spaces for individual contributors to do solo work and learn when it is productive to collaborate versus think alone. Cain envisions workplaces where both group efforts and individual ideas receive focused attention, so that introverts and extroverts alike can share their most groundbreaking concepts forged through quiet persistence.
Part 2. Your biology, yourself? 4. Is temperament destiny? Nature, nurture, and the orchid hypothesis.
Cain examines the age-old question of whether temperament is shaped more by genetics or environment. She outlines the orchid hypothesis, a biological theory that frames both nature and nurture as significant. The orchid hypothesis uses the metaphor of orchids and dandelions to explain differences in people's inborn sensitivity. Dandelions tolerate almost any environment, while orchids thrive spectacularly in ideal conditions but wilt easily otherwise. Similarly, some children are dandelions who tend to be resilient regardless of circumstances, while more sensitive, orchid children can suffer but also flourish given the right nurturing environment. Many psychological theories have framed temperaments like introversion/extroversion as inborn, hardwired traits. But new research demonstrates these dispositional differences actually stem from varying levels of sensitivity to external stimuli determined by genetics and biology. So orchid children are born with heightened reactivity, making them more permeable to both bad and good environments. For orchid children, negative contexts like abuse or neglect can trigger severe psychological difficulties. But positive, nurturing environments allow the same sensitive introverted children to develop great capacities for creativity, empathy, or perseverance. Scientists now see genes and temperament as predispositions heightened by environmental interaction, rather than fixed destinies. Cain shares research on orchid children who struggled with anxiety or aggression in poor settings, yet became wildly successful creative leaders like Steve Jobs when given support to develop strengths. She argues that introverted orchid children thrive when homes and schools nurture interests quietly rather than forcing gregariousness. With the right context, the most sensitive introverts can bloom into innovators and changemakers. However, Cain cautions that even with support, orchid children struggle in environments that do not accommodate different needs. As society embraces extrovert ideals, these sensitive types often feel pressured to pretend to be extroverts. Cain calls for appreciating the unique requirements of all temperaments without forcing anyone to conform to a single, right way of socializing, learning, or working. By truly nurturing all children's sensitivities, she argues society gains richer perspectives that empower achievement.
5. Beyond temperament. The role of free will, and the secret of public speaking for introverts.
While temperament theories argue that personality traits like introversion are fixed, Cain believes identity comprises both nature and nurture. She asserts that free will and context also shape behavior over time, empowering personal growth beyond innate tendencies. Just because temperament inclines certain behaviors does not mean they are immutable character decrees. The chapter shares the poignant example of Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, whose shy nature initially prevented him from fulfilling duties like delivering sermons and visiting the sick. Through spiritual practice, he learned to overcome fear and inertia to speak publicly and connect congregants compassionately. However, the rabbi still requires solitary renewal to recharge from social activity. His example shows introverts can learn skills outside comfort zones while remaining true to their core and natures. Cain shares another story of Professor Winifred Gallagher, who committed to acting more extroverted by saying yes to social invitations. Despite gaining wider circles, Gallagher felt inauthentic and drained from continual socializing. This demonstrates that acting out of character breeds unfulfillment. Introverts fare better leaning into their introversion rather than fighting it. Ultimately, Cain advocates that people accept their introverted or extroverted natures, but not become constrained by them. With self-knowledge, determination, and supportive conditions, individuals can stretch beyond ingrained comfort zones when freely chosen. But growth should not mean abandoning one's temperament completely. Cain calls on society to enable both introvert and extrovert paths to flourishing.
6. Franklin was a politician, but Eleanor spoke out of conscience. Why cool is overrated.
This chapter examines Eleanor Roosevelt's legacy as an introverted political leader and moral voice defined by integrity rather than charisma. Though her husband FDR was known for bold oratory and savvy charm, Eleanor stood apart with her earnest, thoughtful conviction. She transcended expectations for women leaders with her relentless drive for equality and human rights. As First Lady, Roosevelt overcame both gender discrimination and her shy temperament to become a hugely influential figure. She pushed her husband for more progressive policies, connected intimately with impoverished communities, and forged alliances across class and race divides. Her compassion arose not from extroverted schmoozing but a profound sense of social justice cultivated through solitary reading and reflection since childhood. After FDR's death, Eleanor served as a delegate to the United Nations and continued championing civil rights despite strong opposition. Though often seen as plain and lacking charisma compared to her smooth-talking husband, she earned global esteem for her authenticity and moral courage. Her example contradicts assumptions that good leaders must be gregarious, dynamic personalities. Roosevelt succeeded through conviction rather than charm, prioritizing ethics over likability. She moved people through the righteousness of her beliefs rather than the force of an outsized persona. Cain celebrates this model of leadership defined by introverted traits like principled commitment, restrained expression, and dedication to social reform even in the face of hostility. Roosevelt's journey shows that cooler temperaments still ignite great change. Leaders need not captivate crowds with spellbinding oratory if armed with truth and conscience. Cain hopes rediscovering such models allows introverts today to lead unapologetically in ways aligned with inward-oriented gifts rather than extroverted ideals. Leadership and virtue need not hinge on showmanship when integrity and compassion set the course.
7. Why did Wall Street crash and Warren Buffett prosper? How introverts and extroverts think and process dopamine differently.
This chapter explores the latest research on how brain chemistry affects introverts and extroverts differently, especially tied to reward-seeking and risk-taking behavior. Scientists are studying how varying dopamine levels motivate people and shape perceptions of rewards. Extroverts naturally have more active dopamine reward circuits and so crave external stimulation and action to feel rewarded. Introverts, with lower baseline dopamine levels, feel less motivation to seek exhilarating experiences and social highs. This helps explain why extroverts gravitate toward adventurous risks and fast-paced environments, while introverts prefer minimally stimulating situations that allow contemplation. These dopamine differences also affect decision-making abilities. Studies show people are more reckless and impulsive under hyperactive dopamine states triggered by bold risks, novelty-seeking, or even just talking. In contrast, introverts' more modest dopamine levels allow for greater prudence, forethought, and caution. This can confer advantages analyzing information thoroughly before acting. Cain hypothesizes that the 2008 financial crash resulted partially from high-rolling investors acting out of dopamine-fueled impulsiveness instead of rationally weighing risks. Meanwhile, introverted billionaires like Warren Buffett avoided the overheated speculation around big short-term gains in favor of careful, long-view analyses, reaping sustained rewards as a result. In general, introverts' risk-averse and vigilant thinking patterns yield stable returns. But their strengths are easily overpowered by reckless extroverted modes in dopamine-charged contexts like Wall Street. Cain suggests that encouraging introverts' presence could have balanced the markets. She calls for appreciating contrasting decision-making styles instead of assuming extroverts have the best vision.
Part 3. Do all cultures have an extrovert ideal? 8. Soft power, Asian Americans and the extrovert ideal.
This chapter explores why the extrovert ideal can be challenging for Asian Americans balancing Eastern cultural heritage with Western norms. Cain examines the stereotype that Asian cultures promote introverted traits like restraint and humility, while Western society prizes boldness and self-promotion. She argues this oversimplified dichotomy causes identity struggles for Asian Americans pressured to conform. In East Asian Confucian tradition, qualities like discretion, listening ability, and putting community first are paramount. But the extrovert ideal of the West sees the outgoing individualist as the cultural prototype. Cain suggests introverted tendencies get passed intergenerationally in Asian immigrant families adhering to Eastern values. However, Asian American youth absorb prevailing Western biases that their quiet temperaments signify weakness or backwardness. Cain shares studies revealing East Asians are more likely to carry gene variants associated with caution, restraint, and sensitivity to context. This indicates a possible biological/cultural interplay around introversion. However, these same studies show East Asians are not inherently less assertive or ambitious than Westerners overall. Context determines whether introverted traits manifest positively or become hindering. For Asian Americans, tensions around competing cultural ideals of identity emerge early. Asian American students report feeling like the quiet one among peers, causing self-consciousness. Workplace studies show Asian cultures encourage listening before speaking, while Western settings reward speed and volume. Cain argues Western society misinterprets Asian communication patterns rather than accommodating diverse styles. She advocates for shifting cultural attitudes, policies, and education to support both introverts and extroverts equally. Schools should nurture quiet students' talents instead of shaming shyness. Workplaces need to recognize loud talkers do not necessarily make the best leaders if they do not also cultivate wisdom through reflection. Valuing various strengths and diverse perspectives creates room for all people's gifts.
Part 4. How to Love, How to Work. 9. When should you act more extroverted than you really are?
While Cain argues that society should accept and embrace introversion, she acknowledges there are certain contexts where adopting extroverted behaviors can prove useful for introverts. However, she cautions that introverts should be strategic rather than forcing themselves into acting overly gregarious for gregariousness' sake. Cain shares research on role play in relationships, demonstrating that people display more extroverted qualities when motivated to make a good first impression. Introverts report acting more talkative, assertive, and animated early in dating or when networking professionally. However, these same studies showed introverts relax back into their natural reserved styles as intimacy and trust build in relationships. This suggests introverts consciously choose to act extroverted when trying to establish new connections, but should not feel pressure to keep up an overly chatty, outgoing facade once comfort sets in. Cain advises using small talk as a social strategy, in service of deeper relationships that ultimately accept and value authentic introverted nature. Similarly, at times when introverts feel it is worth stretching beyond ingrained tendencies, like giving important speeches or inspiring teams, adopting an extroverted leadership style can sway audiences. But Cain notes even great orators like Gandhi still required solitary contemplation to fuel public persona. Balancing reflective downtime preserves inner resource. Overall, Cain proposes introverts approach more extroverted behaviors strategically rather than a mandate to become extroverts. Too much acting out of character breeds stress and emptiness. But flexing social muscles at selective occasions bears rewards if followed by revitalizing solitude. Harnessing these insights, introverts can expand influence while centered in self-knowledge.
10. The communication gap. How to talk to members of the opposite type.
In this chapter, Cain discusses the communication challenges that can occur between extroverts and introverts. She notes that extroverts and introverts have very different communication preferences that can lead to frustration and miscommunication if not properly understood. Extroverts tend to be highly verbal and think out loud. They prefer to talk through issues and ideas, brainstorming aloud. Introverts, on the other hand, tend to be quiet and deliberate speakers. They prefer to think things through internally before speaking. These different styles can create problems. An extrovert may interpret an introvert's quietness as meaning they lack ideas or are bored. However, the introvert is simply thinking. Likewise, an introvert may feel overwhelmed trying to get a word in with a talkative extrovert and may dismiss the extrovert as loud and aggressive. Cain suggests some solutions to bridge this communication divide. Extroverts should pause frequently when talking to introverts to allow them time to share thoughts. Don't overwhelm introverts with a constant stream of talk. Introverts should know extroverts don't intend to monopolize conversations, they simply feel productive when talking through ideas. Introverts should feel comfortable interjecting. In group settings, balance open group brainstorming sessions with quiet time for individuals to write down ideas before sharing with the larger group. Extroverts should avoid pressuring introverts to share verbally before they are ready. Introverts often prefer to gather their thoughts before speaking. When listening, both types should avoid interrupting the speaker and allow people ample time to fully convey thoughts. Understanding these different communication orientations is key. Both extroverts and introverts have valuable perspectives to share, so patience and willingness to bend one's natural style leads to better communication. The key is mutual understanding of communication preferences. With compromise on both sides, extroverts can make space for introverts while introverts make efforts to interject opinions even when uncomfortable. The result is communication that draws out the strengths of all people involved.
11. On Cobblers and Generals. How to cultivate quiet kids in a world that can't hear them.
In this chapter, Cain argues that quiet, introverted children need understanding and support to thrive, even though extroverted qualities like confidence and leadership are often valued more in our culture. Many quiet kids feel under pressure to act more extroverted and outgoing, even though this goes against their natural tendencies. Cain provides concrete suggestions for parents and teachers to help quiet children. For example, she advises making sure kids have time for solitary activities like reading, building Lego structures, or daydreaming. This helps them recharge since too much social interaction can be draining for introverts. Setting up quiet spaces at school and avoiding overscheduling extracurricular activities gives introverted kids much-needed downtime. Additionally, Cain encourages appreciating and modeling introverted qualities at home, like thinking before speaking, listening closely, and focused independent work. Introverted kids will feel their temperament is valued rather than a problem to correct. Letting children discover their own interests, rather than overly directing their activities, allows them to cultivate self-knowledge and passion. Cain also advises teaching introverted children communication tips used by ambiverts, who can tap both extroverted and introverted skills. For example, looking people in the eye, standing up straight, and speaking clearly and confidently in short sentences can help introverts make a good impression without having to act extroverted. Learning such skills helps introverted kids self-advocate. Ultimately, Cain argues that both extroverted and introverted temperaments offer value. The key is not forcing introverts into an extroverted mold, but rather equipping them with tools to feel empowered while being their naturally quiet selves. With understanding and support, introverted kids can grow into thriving, successful teens and adults even in a loud world.